Hello, APUSH students. We're at Chapter 34, America and World War II, 1941 to 1945. This is a sweeping chapter that goes through the American actions in World War II in both the European and Pacific theaters, talks about notable battles, but what's most important about this chapter is it talks about the effects of World War II on the United States domestically. So we're going to talk about how the war affected different groups and the American people as a whole. And this is going to set the stage for what is going to happen to the United States after World War II, most notably with setting up for the Cold War. So let's get started. First of all, let's make sure we know that the United States was on the Allied side during World War II. They were also on the Allied side during World War I, but during World War II, the Allied forces were primarily the countries of the Soviet Union, United Kingdom, and the United States. There are other groups like the Free French Forces, and the Italians are going to flip during the war, but Russia, Britain, and the United States are kind of known as the Big Three. The group that the United States is fighting against in World War II are known as the Axis powers, which consists of Germany, Japan, and Italy. Despite the fact that the United States was attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor, the United States felt that the country needed to fight the European theater first in the more direct way. So there's this policy that's kind of adopted from the beginning of the war aimed at knocking out Germany first. Once the United States was attacked and entered into World War II, any dissent against joining the war quickly evaporated. Before the war, America was still kind of in this isolationist mindset, and you also had communist groups that opposed the war because they felt that it was capitalistic, and you also had pro-Hitler groups in the United States. But once the war starts, these groups all quickly throw their support behind the war effort. So you're not going to see as much persecution of German Americans during this war. But what you are going to see during this war, however, and very unfortunately, is the singling out of Japanese and Japanese Americans living on the west coast of the United States. There was this fear that was spread that they were harboring foreign sympathies and might be spies for the Japanese. So at the time of World War II, there were about 110,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans living on the west coast of the United States. Executive Order 9066, which was authorized by FDR, called for the internment of those people into internment camps for the duration of the war. They were only allowed to bring what they could carry, and they were confined in these camps for the duration of the war. As a result of this, these people lost their homes and businesses, and after the war, they were left with virtually nothing. Even during the war, the constitutionality of interning American citizens during the war was upheld by the Supreme Court decision of Korematsu v. United States. So it was not until the 1980s that the federal government officially apologized and gave reparations of $20,000 to each surviving person who had been interned during the war. But this is seen as one of the most regrettable actions of the United States government during this time because there was no evidence of any collaboration with the Japanese government among any of these citizens. So this does stand out as one of the, darker aspects of American conduct during the World War II period. And the slang term Jap, racist term referring to the Japanese, was used to describe both the enemy that we were fighting, the Japanese government and the Japanese soldiers, but also, in Japanese people living in the United States as well. Because of World War II, the Great Depression is basically going to end overnight, and millions of Americans are going to be put back to work. What America is going to bring to the war effort for the Allies more than anything is the industrial power of providing war materials. Not only that, but America isn't suffering from bombings or occupation like some of these other countries, so industrial production is going to continue without a lot of impediments for the duration of the war, and it's basically going to go around the clock. Similar to World War I, the federal government is going to take a very active role in directing business during the war. The War Production Board basically halted the manufacture of non-essential items such as passenger cars, and it directed all businesses to produce for the war effort. Car manufacturing plants were converted to produce airplanes and tanks, for example. The government also imposed a national speed limit to limit the consumption of gasoline. The Office of Price Administration imposed rations on the American people and limited the amount of goods people could buy. And the National War Labor Board set limits on wage increases to try to help regulate labor. Union membership is going to increase from 10 million to 13 million during World War II. But organized labor is going to resent a lot of the interventions from the government. There are going to be a number of walkouts and strikes that are going to challenge the government intervening in business during this time. The Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act, passed in June of 1943, responded by saying, if you struck went on strike rather, in a government-operated industry, that was considered a criminal offense. And it also authorized the federal government to seize and operate any industries that were tied up by strikes. I mean, this is a huge role the government is taking on, more than ever before in the role of business. But they deemed it necessary during the war effort to keep production going. Over 15 million men enlisted during World War II, and 216,000 women were employed for non-combat duties such as the WACs, waves, and spars. So they were in the military, but served in auxiliary and support roles. So we're going to see larger participation from women in both the military and in the workforce. Because so many men were needed to fight in the war, there was a shortage in the number of farm and factory workers in the United States. So in order to keep production going and feed all the people fighting the war, there were a number of demographic shifts that are going to occur during the war. The Bracero program was instituted to allow for Mexican agricultural workers to come across the border during harvest times to harvest fruit and grain crops in the West. This program is going to continue well into the 1950s and actually ends up becoming a part of the agricultural economy in these Western states. And then, of course, there's the role that women played during the war, where more than 6 million women took jobs outside of the home. And out of those 6 million, over half of those women had never worked for a wage before and maybe had been confined to housework. So this is going to be a huge shift. The government accommodated this demand for labor by setting up daycare centers. But after the war, there's going to be this equally large push from the government to get these women to leave their jobs and return to the home. So after the end of the war, 2/3 of the women who worked outside of the home are going to end up leaving these factory jobs. And there's this popular perception that women were happy to leave their jobs and return to this role of wife and mother, but that is a huge oversimplification. So this shows propaganda being used to support women's work during the war, you can see on the left, and then you can see how that gets turned into trying to support women leaving these jobs after the war. Many women saw this availability of work as a revolutionary new change in the roles women were going to be able to take, but on the whole, society saw this as a temporary wartime measure. The war is also going to trigger migration from other population centers in the United States, places that are helping to produce war materials. So cities like Los Angeles, Detroit, Seattle, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, they're going to grow in size tremendously during this time. The state of California, for example, gains 2 million more people as a result of wartime production. And for some reason, the South got a lot more defense contracts during the war, which kind of paves the way for the development of what we call the Sun Belt region. It's this larger demographic shift that occurs in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. I'm going to show you a map in just a minute that's going to illustrate that. African Americans in the South are going to experience what's known as the second Great Migration, the first one being during World War I. The work available in cities is going to attract African Americans out of the South to places all over the country. This also means that discrimination and segregation are going to become issues not only focused in the South, but become nationwide issues. So let's also remember why America is fighting the war. It's to defeat dictators. And compare that treatment of African Americans in the United States with the treatment of some of the minorities in those countries like Germany or Italy. So civil rights groups are going to push for more gains during the war as a result of what the war's goals are. One group even planned a march on Washington to address discrimination in federal hiring practices. And Franklin Roosevelt was able to divert the march by invoking Executive Order 8802, which banned discrimination in federal defense industries. And it also led to the establishment of the Fair Employment Practices Commission to help monitor the compliance with this executive order. So this shows demographic shifts during the war. And you can see that more people are moving to the South and West than up to the North. 2.5 million African Americans enlisted in World War II, and over 1 million are going to serve in the military. During the war, civil rights organizations pushed the Double V campaign, which called for victory abroad against fascism and victory at home against racism. Despite this, African Americans served in segregated units, but unlike World War I, they are going to be able to participate in combat operations, although still in a limited capacity. In 1942, the Congress of Racial Equality was founded in Chicago with the goal of using nonviolent resistance to end segregation. This group is going to continue to work for civil rights and become a prominent civil rights organization in the 1950s and 1960s. I just wanted to mention that they were founded during this time. We're going to talk about them when we talk more about the civil rights movement. Native Americans contributed to the war, most notably through being code talkers. by transmitting information in their native languages, which the German and Japanese codebreakers were unable to decipher for the duration of the war. Similar to World War I, this migration of different groups for wartime work is going to lead to overcrowding in cities, and racial tensions are going to erupt in riots and unrest. Two of the most notable events during World War II were the Zoot Suit riots aimed at the Latino community in Los Angeles and the racial violence in Detroit directed at the African American community in 1943. Overall, people in the United States prospered from World War II as real wages rose and unemployment virtually disappeared because of the need for the production of wartime materials. Now, I just want to mention here, and your book makes note of this, that the overall cost of World War II was $330 billion, which doesn't sound like a lot given today's dollars and spending today. But just to put that in perspective, $330 billion was 10 times the amount spent on World War I, and it's twice as much as all of the previous federal spending since 1776. So look at like all the money the federal government has spent from the time America was a country until 1941, and it's double that. Okay, so it's a lot. What I mean to say. So you remember that how the New Deal was this experimental way of the government providing jobs for the people. Well, this need for defense work and war materials, as well as people being employed in the armed services, is going to expand the amount of government spending significantly, as well as expanding the role of government, and that's going to carry over after the war is over. Just to put it in perspective, federal spending during World War II, and then federal spending after the war, you're going to see that trend increase and carry over. Don't ask me why, but we call the war in Europe the European theater and the war in Asia the Pacific theater. I don't know why they're called theaters, but anyway, we're going to talk about the Pacific theater first, then go to the European theater, and then talk about how the war ends with the atomic bombings in Japan. So the Japanese military actually had some initial successes in World War II. The attack on Pearl Harbor was in December of 1941, and it set back the American Navy a pretty good deal. Lucky for the Navy, all the aircraft carriers were off doing maneuvers and weren't damaged in the Pearl Harbor attack, which is why the U.S. Navy wasn't completely crippled at the start of 1942. But right after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese moved aggressively on other Allied imperial holdings in the Pacific. And as you remember, the United States had control over the Philippines, so the Japanese moved quickly against the Philippines. And it was there that American troops, supported by some Filipino soldiers, were able to hold off the Japanese until April of 1942. But again, the American Navy couldn't really support them effectively. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of U.S. forces in the Pacific, is forced to leave the Philippines, but famously vowed that he would return, which he's going to do in 1944. Unfortunately, though, he had to leave troops there, and when they were all captured by the Japanese forced them to march about 60 miles to prisoner of war camps further inland. During this time, soldiers were killed if they stopped walking and were sometimes just randomly killed by the Japanese. And this event was labeled as the Bataan Death March. It stands out as one of the many examples of Japanese brutality during the war. One thing we should talk about is that there were a lot of atrocities committed by both sides during the war, especially in the Pacific theater. But it's the reports of Japanese treatment of prisoners of war that is going to become widely publicized and used for propaganda purposes by the American press. The turning point in the war, which basically is when things start to turn against the Japanese, is the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. The preceding Battle of the Coral Sea was the first battle that the United States won against the Japanese, where they inflicted heavy losses on Japanese aircraft carriers. The Battle of Midway is super important because Japan loses 4 of its aircraft carriers, and they are never going to be able to rebuild effectively after those losses. The rest of the war is going to be defensive for the Japanese, and they're going to hold on tightly to the islands they had taken possession of. Essentially, they overexpanded and gained too much land and too much territory, and they weren't able to effectively hold it, especially after they start to lose these aircraft carriers. In a larger sense, I want to just mention the most important weapons in World War II are going to be tanks and airplanes. So these big old battleships are not really going to matter now as much as aircraft carriers. In 1942, Americans took possession of the island of Guadalcanal, which is close to Australia. This is the first of many islands that Allied forces are going to take during World War II, and it leads to the larger development of the island hopping strategy. Basically, island hopping consisted of bypassing the really heavily fortified Japanese areas and taking small islands, building airfields on those islands, and then bombing the fortified army bases rather than directly assaulting them. So by the end of 1944, the United States had regained control of the Philippines and had captured the island of Saipan. One notable event in Saipan was that American forces found that Japanese civilians were throwing themselves off of cliffs rather than face capture by the Americans. Japanese soldiers rarely surrendered, and that was a trend seen at Guadalcanal and other battles. But this was unique for civilians because, typically the civilians didn't do this, but they had been told by the Japanese military that the Americans were going to do all kinds of horrible things if they captured them. So, this idea that the civilian population is going to be mobilized, that's on the minds of the Americans as bombers are now within reach of the Japanese mainland, and discussions are underway for the invasion of the Japanese mainland. So this map shows the furthest extent of the Japanese Empire and some of the major battles of the war. You can see the attack on Pearl Harbor, as well as the Battle of Midway. I also want to note that Japan did take control of 2 small islands in Alaska to try to divert American forces. And if you look at that island hopping strategy, you can see that each of those battles is leading the United States and the Allied forces closer to the mainland of Japan. At the time the United States entered World War II, Axis forces had taken large amounts of Europe, including France, Norway, and Yugoslavia. Despite the civilian populations in the United Kingdom being heavily bombed by the Nazi planes, the United Kingdom refused to surrender and continued to fight against the Nazis. However, they were low on resources and couldn't mount any real offensive operations. Hitler knew he had to knock Britain out of the war, so in June of 1941, Hitler invades the Soviet Union in an attempt to remove the Russians as a possible ally for the British. Initially, the invasion of the Soviet Union goes really well for Hitler, but Soviet troops rallied, and by the winter of 1941, the Nazi advance was halted. It's at this time the United States enters the war, and Germany declares war on the United States on December 11, 1941. But the American military is unprepared to mount an assault on the European mainland. So, the Air Force is established initially as a branch of the Army with the goal of launching offensive operations against Nazi-occupied territories. So what would happen is typically the American forces would bomb cities by day, and the British would bomb cities at night. It's also around this time that the Battle of Stalingrad takes place in the Soviet Union at the end of 1942, beginning of 1943. This is the turning point of the war in the European theater because it is the furthest advance of Hitler's troops, and the war now turns into trying to force Hitler to retreat and make advances on the Nazis. I know in U.S. history we talk about D-Day a lot, and it is really important, but this is the largest battle of the war, and it stands out as really the true turning point for the European theater. FDR wanted to invade France in 1942 and 1943 to try to stop the Russians from being defeated at Stalingrad and divert Nazi troops from there, but the American military was just too unprepared for that. So they reluctantly called off plans for an invasion through France and instead focused on freeing up North Africa from Nazi control. This would also cut off oil supplies to Hitler, and over the course of 1943, American forces advance across North Africa. The Casablanca Conference in January 43, which is in Morocco, was between Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. At the conference, they essentially agreed to scale up the Pacific War and made plans to invade Sicily to put more pressure on Italy. It's also during this time that they insist on unconditional surrender, which is basically saying that the enemy has no bargaining power whatsoever and has to accept any terms the Allies give to them. So it's hard to prove whether this shortened the war or lengthened the war, because if the losing side has no negotiating power, there's a chance they're going to fight even harder. But it also did set the stage for a post-war world where, Hitler wouldn't be around. So, you can see positives and negatives maybe to this policy. By August of 1943, Sicily fell to Allied troops, and Mussolini, who was the leader of Italy, was deposed and taken out of power. By June of 1944, Allied forces were in Rome. But getting over the Alps and into Germany is going to be nearly impossible, so there's this need to open up another front in the war and invade the European mainland some other way. This is what leads to the D-Day invasion, which takes place in June of 1944. Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, had been putting pressure on the Allies to open up another front in the war. The Soviet Union had lost millions of troops and civilians and were confronting 90% of the Nazi fighting force. So at the Tehran Conference, which was the first meeting between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, it was agreed that the United States and the British would plan a cross-channel invasion into France. This operation was known as Operation Overlord, but it's now commonly known as D-Day. So keep in mind there are a lot of D-Days in World War II because D-Day stands for Deployment Day. But this is one of the biggest coordinated, well, actually it is the biggest coordinated land, sea, and air operation in all of world history. So that's why it's called basically D-Day, the big one, right? The plan was to attack Nazi positions in France along what was known as the Atlantic Wall, which was a defensive barrier against Allied invasion all along the coast of France. 5 beaches were chosen, and June 6th was the day that the coordinated assault from the American, British, and Canadian forces began. They were able to maintain a foothold in France and were not kicked out. And so from there, it's going to open up Allied advances against Hitler on the Western Front. There's a lot of stuff going on this map, but basically covers the entirety of the European theater. So let's first talk about the Allied invasion of North Africa at the end of 1942 and 1943, going with Sicily and Rome in June of 1944. This is the Battle of Stalingrad out here, the turning point for the European theater. And so then from there, the Soviets start to make an advance against Hitler on the Eastern Front. This is the site of the D-Day invasion, June 6, 1944. And from there, Allies and the American forces are making a push to liberate Nazi Germany. This was the staging area for the D-Day, and he was seen as too liberal by the conservative Democrats. So there was this push at the Democratic Convention to find someone who was a little more moderate. So that's why Harry Truman basically was unknown, and he'd just been elected to the Senate. He was chosen as FDR's vice president in the 1944 election. Truman and Roosevelt had barely met and really didn't talk a whole lot during the first part of Roosevelt's term. So the Democrats won pretty handily again, in part because the focus of the 1944 election was on foreign policy and shaping the post-war world, and the Republicans still kind of had that isolationist strain left over from World War I. Okay, so it's winter of 1944. The D-Day invasion has happened. Allies are in France and advancing east. Hitler tries one last attempt to repel the Allied advance in what is known as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler concentrates all of his forces into one area of the Ardennes forest. Let's pause and take a drink. Bulge. Three, two, one. Okay, so it's winter of 1944. The D-Day invasion has happened. The Allies are in France and advancing east. So Hitler tries one last attempt to repel the Allied advance in what is known as the Battle of the Bulge. So Hitler basically concentrates all of his forces into one area in the Ardennes forest in an attempt to divide Allied troops and push them back. However, despite being in the middle of a snowstorm and lacking supplies, and as you can see on this map, being completely surrounded by the Nazis before World War II. But the scale of the Nazi Holocaust was not fully known until after the war, and a lot of the concentration camps were east of Berlin, and so the Soviets found them before the Americans did, and it's around April 45 that the Americans discover concentration camps in Western Germany. The Soviets are the first to reach Berlin in April of 1945, and on April 30th, Hitler commits suicide in his bunker underneath Berlin. 3 weeks prior to that, Franklin Roosevelt dies of a cerebral hemorrhage while he was receiving treatments in Warm Springs, Georgia. So this puts Harry Truman into the president's chair right as the war was ending in Europe. So by May 7th, the German government surrendered unconditionally, and May 8th is commemorated as VE, or Victory in Europe Day, which marks the end of the European theater in World War II. Going back to the Pacific theater, the war was continuing, and the United States was still going through its island hopping strategy against Japan. With the capture of Saipan, long-range bombers could now reach the Japanese mainland, and American forces engaged in massive bombing campaigns on the civilian population of Japan. One of the most significant was in Tokyo in March of 1945, in which a quarter of the buildings of the city were destroyed and approximately 80,000 civilians were killed. In March of 1945, the small island of Iwo. 3, 2, 1. Going back to the Pacific Theater, the war was continuing and the United States. 3, 2, 1. So going back to the Pacific Theater, which is still going on after VE Day, the United States is continuing to bomb the Japanese mainland after the capture of Saipan. Long-range bombers can now reach the Japanese mainland. One of the most significant attacks was the firebombing of Tokyo in March of 1945, in which a quarter of the buildings in the city were destroyed and approximately 80,000 civilians were killed. In March of 45, the small island of Iwo Jima was captured by Allied forces, and in April of 45, Allied forces invaded Okinawa, which is the first island in Japan to be invaded by the Allies. That's, technically part of the Japanese homeland. So at this point, Japan has lost all of its aircraft carriers, so their navy was essentially done, and all their skilled pilots had been shot down by the Allies, which is why the Japanese now resort to the kamikaze strategy at this point in the war. Kamikaze was a word that meant divine wind, and essentially it meant loading up a plane with explosives and intentionally ramming it into an American ship. The Japanese hoped that the Americans would lose their resolve to continue to fight and would eventually give up and be willing to negotiate peace terms. Also at the Battle of Okinawa, there were 50,000 American casualties and almost double the number of Japanese casualties. So again, if you take into account the impending invasion of the Japanese mainland, it was evidence to a lot of people that the Japanese were going to fight pretty hard. As we talk about the decision to use the atomic bomb, that weighed heavily on people's minds. So at the Potsdam Conference, which occurred in July 1945 between Stalin, Truman, and Churchill, although he was about to be replaced, the conference issued an ultimatum to Japan to surrender or be destroyed. It was at the previous conference at Yalta that the Soviet Union had pledged to join the war against Japan after the war in Europe was over. So they're getting ready to invade Japan in August of 1945. So it's also at the Potsdam Conference that Truman receives word of a successful test of the first atomic bomb. So just to give you some backstory on this, the plans to develop an atomic bomb had been proposed to Roosevelt in 1940 by Albert Einstein. Roosevelt requested that Congress allocate money to develop and research this possibility. So basically, the science of how it would work was already out there, and scientists around the world knew that it was theoretically possible. But in order to have the munitions and the amount of unstable isotopes produced to trigger an atomic reaction would require a huge scientific endeavor. Other countries like Japan and Germany had talked about doing it, and Germany had invested some money in it, but they abandoned their plans by 1943. So America was the only country that was really heavily invested in developing the atomic bomb. It becomes known as the Manhattan Project because of the number of scientists who coordinated the project. Many of them were from Columbia University in New York. The Manhattan Project spread out across the United States and involved a number of the top scientific minds in the world. Many of them were refugees from Nazi-occupied territories, such as Albert Einstein, although Einstein didn't actually work directly on the Manhattan Project. He just proposed the idea to Roosevelt. So basically, as you can see here, Oak Ridge was the place where the uranium was enriched down there in Tennessee. And Richland at Hanna began bombing mainland Japan. There were several sites that were reserved in case the atomic bomb was developed, so that the effect of its damage could be studied. Originally, Kyoto was on the list, but archaeologists urged the president to take it off because of its cultural value as the imperial capital for almost 1,000 years. So if you ever go to Japan, Kyoto is one of the only cities that still has a lot of original buildings, whereas huge portions of Japanese cities were destroyed by conventional bombing or atomic bombing during World War II, so they look a lot more modern. Other interesting fact you might want to know is that Kokura was actually the primary target in the second atomic attack, but there was the view was obscured by smoke from a conventional firebombing attack the previous day, so the pilots instead went to the secondary target, which was Nagasaki. On August 6th, the American plane called the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. 70,000 people were instantly killed, and ultimately 180,000 people were killed, wounded, or missing. 2 days later, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan and began invading Manchuria in China. The next day, the Americans dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, which resulted in 80,000 people killed, wounded, or missing. The next day, Japan asked for peace on the condition that the emperor be allowed to remain on the throne, but he would lose all of his political power. The Allies accepted this, and on August 14th, 3, 2, 1. On August 6th, the American plane, the Enola Gay, dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. 70,000 people were killed instantly, and ultimately 180,000 people were killed, wounded, or missing. 2 days later, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan and began invading Japanese-held positions in China. The next day, the Americans dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki, which resulted in 80,000 people killed, wounded, or missing. The next day, so on the 10th, Japan asked for peace on the condition that the emperor be allowed to remain on the throne, but would lose all of his political power. The Allies accepted this proposition on August 14th, and that next day, the 15th, is known. The surrender wasn't until September 2nd, but August 15th is the date that is observed. If we look at comparative losses during the war, it's important to note that the United States offered huge amounts of industrial power during the war. The United States is going to spend more on the war than any other country. Okay, and as you can see, almost 400,000 Americans die in the war, so that is a significant loss. But if you compare that to the Soviet Union, the people who lost more people during the war, comparatively, is going to be the Soviet Union. In terms of the human cost of the war, it's the deadliest war in all of history, with approximately 85 million people killed. Out of that number, only 1/3 of those deaths were military casualties. So this war had incredibly devastating effects on the civilian populations of the world. In a broader sense, America is going to emerge as a very strong nation after the war. They were relatively undamaged in terms of not suffering civilian casualties, and by the end of the war, they're going to account for 50% of the world's industrial production. This is going to lead to a dramatic change in America's role in world affairs and the standard of living for Americans. And with world affairs, it's going to change their role in large part because the United States and the Soviet Union are the only two superpowers that were still standing after the war. And as the Soviet Union starts to establish communist governments in Eastern Europe, this is going to set the stage for a broader conflict and confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union in the form of the Cold War. Here's the timeline. Thank you for listening.